Good evening and Happy New Year to all of those who are attending this talk. My name is Faris Hussain and I'm one of the Medics.Academy and FDocs team members. Tonight, I'm introducing our Speciality webinar speaker, Dr. Mark Stacey. Dr. Stacey is a consultant obstetric anaesthetist based in Cardiff. His talk tonight is about performance under pressure. As the lead organiser of the Healthcare Professional Performance Enhancing course, MedTrim, Dr. Stacey is passionate about getting clinicians to excel in stressful situations. Having heard versions of his talk at medical school and as a newly qualified doctor, I'm very excited to hear what insights he has to share with us this evening. As always, please, if you have any questions during the webinar tonight, please post them in the dedicated FDocs Slack channel. I hope that you very much enjoyed the talk. Over to Dr. Stacey.
So, good evening. I hope that you are all well and coping with the current issues that we have worldwide. My name is Mark Stacey. I'm a consultant anaesthetist who works in Cardiff. I have an interest in performance under pressure, and I subtitled this talk Learn or Die because I truly believe that if we get our learning right, our patients will do much better. So the first time I tried to give this talk was in 2017, or a version of this talk. And it was at the Royal Society of Medicine, which is just outside Oxford Street in London. And I'd got to the second slide when a massive influx of people came rushing into the back of the theatre. I thought the organizer who'd invited me was trying to see how I responded to performance under pressure. And then I noticed that some of the individuals who'd entered the theatre were young, very young. Some of them were even children. And it turned out that there had been a massive scare on Oxford Circus railway station, and people had piled into the Royal Society of Medicine, and they had then locked the doors to stop any more people coming in. So instead of talking about performance under pressure, I went on to talk about stress management and resilience, and until we were let out some few hours later. But for this session, I'm going to talk about performance under pressure. And what I'm going to get you to do to get an idea of how well you perform under pressure is I'm going to get you to take a nice deep breath in when I say. And then I want you to hold that breath until you spot the mistake in the next slide. I will stop the exercise at 30 seconds, just in case any of you are struggling to hold your breath for that long. So are you ready? Take a nice deep breath in and off you go. So if you haven't spotted the mistake, you better take a nice deep breath in now, because I don't want anybody fainting during the course of this session. So what I'd like you all to do is to think of a skill that you're really good at, and ask yourself the question, how did I get good at that skill? And I suspect if you answer that honestly and you think about it in a reflective fashion, you will probably come up with the components of what I'm going to talk about in the next 30 minutes or so. I did a master's in medical education in 2007, and my dissertation was focused on performance under pressure. So I spent 3 years trying to answer that question, and I suspect you could answer it correctly in considerably less time. As part of that process, I developed a course called MedTrim, which is a well-being course, which looks at improving stress management in clinicians. I'm lucky enough to work with two outstanding individuals, Professor Andy McCann, who's the gentleman on the left here, who's a professor of sports psychology, and Steve Eaton, who is a retired Special Forces captain. I'm hoping they've learnt a bit from me, because I certainly learnt an awful lot from them. And this quote I use regularly to try and remind us of how important practicing is to our profession, and how we underestimate our performance and overestimate our skills. I'm a consultant obstetric anaesthetist. I spend a lot of my time dealing with particularly potentially challenging obstetric cases, but I'm also an airway expert and deal with difficult and challenging airway cases, which is one of the reasons I got you to hold your breath earlier, just to give you an idea of the time frame of the work that I work in. This is a baobab tree, and I use it to remind me. You'll actually see this picture on my Twitter feed, whatever that is. And I use it to remind me on a daily basis of the dangers of arrogance and overconfidence. Because what the Africans say about the baobab is that God was so unimpressed with its bloated arrogance that he planted it upside down. And that's why it looks as though the roots are growing towards the sky. It's also to remind me of what I call the 90% rule. And that is that 90% of what I'm telling you I think is correct. I just can't tell you which 90%. So the summary of this talk I can divide into 3 components of what I call inflexible content, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. And the 3 components are quite simple. In order to perform something under pressure, particularly a skill, you need to learn it right, practice it right, and then perform it right. So let's start with a few thoughts about thinking. Now, thinking is slow, effortful, and uncertain. Nevertheless, as individuals, we find successful thinking pleasurable as we link our long-term memory to our working memory. And in particular, when we're solving problems, critical thinking is tied to background knowledge, both physical and cognitive. So in order to just encourage you to think a little bit in a way that perhaps you weren't expecting, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. And what I'd like you to try and do is answer those questions by yourself. Don't use Google. And if it takes you some time to answer them, then it takes you some time to answer them. You'll know when you've got them right. So here's the first question. Complete the word below with a single letter without using the letter E. And here's the second question. You have 6 identical length pencils. I'd like you to make 4 and only 4 equilateral triangles. This is an interesting problem because I often discover that many of my clinical colleagues don't actually know what an equilateral triangle is. So I'll leave that with you to work out over the next few hours or days if you're really unlucky. Now let me introduce you to one of my favorite models. This is the simplest model of the mind. Its relevance to performance will become obvious, but what you may not realize or appreciate, and I didn't until about 10 or so years ago, is its importance to learning and teaching. And it's based around an understanding of what's called a working memory, or what psychologists call the bottleneck of the mind. And the working memory is a bottleneck between 2 things, a skill, and I don't think it matters what the skill is. The skill in this example is the skill of spotting a sick patient, the A, B, C, D, E approach, and your long-term memory. And in the 1950s, a fellow called Ronald Miller looked at how big the working memory was. And he wrote a paper called The Magical Number 7, because he considered that at any one specific moment in time, our memory could hold on to maybe 7 plus or minus 2 components of information. Personally, I've always thought 7 was an overestimate. And one of his colleagues, psychological colleagues, many years later in the 2000s, a fellow called Cowan, looked again at his work and said, actually, no, it's not 7 plus or minus 2, it's nearer 4 plus or minus 1. Now, I used to say as a joke that this is because over the intervening 50 years, Our reliance on smartphone technology has actually made us stupid. But there is a considerable amount of evidence now to show that this is probably true. It has made us lazy. We don't use our working memory as well as we used to. And so here's a summary. In the 50s, 7 plus or minus 2 model. 2010, this number dropped from 7 plus or minus 2 to 4 plus or minus 1. And we will discuss the effect of stress on this model later on. Because although the working memory is very limited, our long-term memory is absolutely huge. It is likely that if this slide was a pictorial representation of my working memory, my long-term memory is possibly bigger than Europe. And just to give you an idea of your limited working memory, is while you were looking at the slides and listening to me speak, did you notice that I changed each of the quotes at the bottom left-hand corner? So going back to the question I asked you earlier, think of that skill. How did you get good at it? So the first thing about the skill is you've got to learn it right. The problem here is, what do you learn? How much do you learn? And what is it about learning that we struggle with? So in 1988, when I was an SHO in Bristol, the training mantra was see one, do one, teach one. And one of my old bosses actually said to me, if you're not sure what you're doing, put on a mask of relaxed brilliance. This is one of my SHO colleagues in Bristol who you may or may not recognize. He was a neonatal trainee, and he made this comment when he was talking about his training. I can remember my first intubation. He was advised, you've got 2 small tubes, one above the other. One right, one totally wrong. No pressure. So why should we learn it right? Well, there is an expectation around clinicians that that we're professionals. And to be professionals, there's an expectation of selflessness. There's an expectation of skill and an expectation of trustworthiness. And in order to combine those 3 properties requires both discipline and vigilance on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis, something that I think has undoubtedly been exemplified by the medical response to the current pandemic. So here's my summary of my model. And as I said, you can probably understand that when this working memory acts as a bottleneck, your potential for skill may be compromised. So if you think back to when you were a medical student and you were taught the A, B, C, D, E of managing a sick patient, and I gave you a sick patient as a medical student, I suspect unless you were truly exceptional, you wouldn't get past the letter A. As you get more, and the term we use is experience, you can get down to E or even to Z. What are the reasons for this? Well, the first reason is you've got much more stuff in your long-term memory. The term a psychologist use is schemata, but it's just stuff. It's just lots of stuff on A, lots of stuff on B, etc. The other thing is that as you get more experienced, you're less likely to be affected by the constraining effects of stress. And I'll come back to that later. So when you're learning it, it's important to ensure that the working memory is not overloaded by what I call inflexible content, which is often considered by educationists to be similar to rote learning, but it isn't rote learning. Rote learning is the kind of answer that the 7-year-old gave when asked what the equator was. He replied, it's a menagerie line running around the Earth through Africa. Well, I couldn't find a menagerie line, but I did find this picture of a lion drinking a martini. So there's an apocryphal story about Planck. This is the gentleman on the left is Max Planck, and the gentleman on the right is his chauffeur. And the story goes along these lines. Planck was a German theoretical physicist who originated quantum theory, and that won him the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1918. And on the back of that, he used to go around lecturing in these lecture halls, which I would normally be giving this lecture in, for example. And he would give the same lecture word for word, every single time. And he'd be driven from venue to venue by his chauffeur, sitting here, who would sit at the front of the audience with his cap on the table and listen to Max lecture. So after the 20th time he'd heard this lecture, the chauffeur said to Max, "I tell you what, Max, why don't you have the night off tonight? You can sit at the front with my hat. I'll give the lecture. I've heard it so many times now, I'll have no difficulty delivering it word perfectly." So Max thought, what a great idea. At which point the chauffeur stood up, gave this absolutely immaculate word for word copy of Max Planck's lecture. And at the end of which, a German professor stood up at the back of the theatre and asked the most ridiculously difficult question. The chauffeur, without batting an eye, said, "That question, sir, is so easy to answer, I'm going to refer it to my chauffeur," as he pointed at Max. Now, the point about this story isn't so much the rapidity of thinking of the chauffeur, but more about the way that we learn and what we do with that information. So I tend to look for things that I try and learn, particularly learning the right thing. Incidentally, that last component, how to fall off a unicycle, I'd be grateful for any coaches out there, because 3 years later, I'm still falling off a unicycle, and I would like to change that to how to ride a unicycle. Interestingly, I bought this book for my son. I'll often ask in a group of, when I'm giving this lecture, how many individuals consider themselves expert drivers, or above average drivers, certainly. And you soon realize that many clinicians have a very deluded idea of what above average actually means. It's a great book, actually. There's some really sensible advice in there. One of the things he points out is that unless you've had any training passing your driving test for the first time, you have had less training than a barista. And the second bit of advice he says is that every time you get into a car, you should say to yourself, "I'm now driving a 2.5-ton killing machine." If we look at shoelace tying, I would like you to consider, or just perhaps vote in your head, which of these do you think is correct? The shoelace on the left or the shoelace on the right? Those of you who understand your knots will of course realize that this is a reef knot and is much less likely to come undone than the slip knot on the left. For over 50 years, this is how I tied my shoelaces, probably based on the way I was taught as a child. And I suspect at least a proportion of the audience will also tie their shoelaces in a similar fashion. Interestingly, the first time I used this slide was in Australia, and most of the audience looked at their feet and to check, and of course most of them were wearing flip-flops. So learn lots. It makes learning easier, the learning grows exponentially, and the rich get richer. So let's move on to practice. Now, the aim of any performance under pressure is to turn a skill into a habit and ultimately into behavior. And if you're interested in developing and learning habits, both learning good habits and getting rid of bad habits, I commend this book to you, Atomic Habits by James Clear. It will give you a variety of very practical strategies that will enable you to improve your skill sets. But a lot of the work on expertise is taken from this man. This is Anders Ericsson, an emeritus professor of psychology. He spent 40 years looking at experts and how you develop expertise. And he talks about 5 steps to mastery: deliberate practice, repeat, repeat, repeat. I particularly like 3, seek constant critical feedback. I don't know about you, but I think most of us don't actually like receiving critical feedback, particularly if it's constant. But if we want to improve, we all need to focus ruthlessly on where you need help. And the realities of developing mastery in anything are that it's going to be both mentally and physically exhausting. So practice it right. And as Bruce Lee said, I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. And when we practice, I tend to divide the practice into 4 different components. There's a physical component, there's a cognitive component, there's the effective teams, and then there's a planning component. And in order to optimize each of these 4 components, whenever I'm teaching anything, I tend to try and base that teaching and training around what I call context-specific training, i.e. the training maps to the performance. And the basic philosophy is very simple, but sometimes quite challenging to do. So the first is control what you can control. And the second is do your best. Now the reality is sometimes, or many times, we don't control what we can control. And what that means is we rarely do our best. And there's a difference between doing your best and trying your hardest. And I'll give you an example in the next slide. And just focusing a bit more on what deliberate practice is. It's focused, it's well structured, it's specific, it's deliberate. You need feedback, and the best kind of feedback is probably from videos. And as you get better at something, you need to set goals beyond your current level of performance. Erickson's work showed that if you want to become an expert in something, you probably needed to do 4 hours of practice a day, 250 days a year for 10 years. And Malcolm Gladwell multiplied those numbers up and talked about the 10,000 hour rule. Once you get really good at something, you need to find a way of maintaining those skills. And that in itself can be quite challenging. A simpler challenge I'm going to give you today is what I call the rule of 30, which is you can consider yourself competent, not an expert, at cannulation when you've done 30 cannulations in a row without making a mistake. And each time you make a mistake, you go back down to 1. And when you've achieved that, come back to me and I'll give you another challenge on cannulation in terms of improving your performance. And the reason physical practice is so important is because, as this quote from the batsman says, how are you going to think and hit at the same time? So you need physical practice. I teach a lot of airway skills, in particular fiber optics. I practice on mannequins. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that if you practice routinely on mannequins, that skill maps straight across to performance in the clinical domain. Additionally, cognitive practice is very useful, and I often discuss challenging cases with my colleagues in order to ensure that if we're actually faced with a challenging case that we haven't seen before, we at least have an idea of how we can manage that. Some of the strategies that we use include visualization, so doing a mental walkthrough of what happens, playing the what ifs game. What if this happens? I'll do this. What if this happens? I'll do this. But what if I can't do this? Okay, well then I'll have to make sure that if I can't do it, I know somebody who can, or I'll have to do something different. And importantly, we need to understand that the regular practice diminishes the likelihood of stress interfering with the performance. And as Cliff Reed says, Cliff is a very good trainer in Australia. He's an A&E consultant. And this is one of my favorite quotes from him. We have the most sophisticated 3D high-fidelity immersive simulator in the known universe. It's the one in our head. Because on the road to success, there are no shortcuts. And you probably didn't notice the quote on the back of this thing, but that's one of my favorites. Our most valuable resource sits 53 feet ahead. But we don't all have 10,000 hours. So is there a way of short-circuiting some of these practice rules? Well, these are some principles taken from Josh Kaufman's book, which I find incredibly valuable when I'm trying to train individuals quickly. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they are all worth addressing. I'm just going to deal with 2 of them specifically. So the first is focus your energy on one skill at a time, because we are incapable of multitasking. I'm afraid even you ladies are incapable of multitasking. All you're doing when you multitask is you're switching your focus and your concentration from one skill to another skill, and then back to the skill that you were doing in the first place. And this is hugely cognitively demanding, and also means that you don't actually apply your best learning or your best performance to either skill. The second principle I want to focus on is the fourth on this list again, and that is deconstructing the skill into sub-skills. Because of the limitations of the working memory, it's easier to teach somebody 4 sub-skills than one overall skill that has 4 components to it. For example, one of the techniques that I get the trainees to practice if they're performing spinals with me is to practice setting up the tray, preferably outside theatre. This is a sub-skill, and it's one that can be easily practiced in a less stressful environment than an operating theatre with an awake patient and a stern-looking consultant. Additionally, as I said earlier, I teach a lot of fibre optics, and I think I can teach anybody fibre optics. What we've done here is set up a context-specific skill set for training fibre optic intubation. In addition, there is a camera here that videos the person performing the skill. And what I sometimes do if I want to increase the physiological stress is to get the individual to run up and down a flight of stairs. This particular individual who is performing a fibre optic as skillfully as most of my trainees is actually one of my secretaries. In addition to practicing as an individual, particularly in the environment we work in, we need to practice in teams. And this is hugely important to minimize the effect of human factor components to our own performance. Because if we're working in teams, we all need to be in the same movie in order for that performance to be optimized. These guys practice in teams. They're cycling at 60 kilometers an hour with a couple of inches between each bike on a bike with no brakes. That's teamwork. What about the pilots? This group of pilots managed to land this plane with this engine that was severely damaged. Quite a remarkable bit of flying, but an even more remarkable bit of teamwork. And here's a slightly different example. The next slide will ask you a question. It will be on the screen for 10 seconds, by which time you will have to have committed to an answer. Everybody ready? Here we go. If it takes 5 builders 5 days to build 5 brick walls, how many days does it take 100 builders to build 100 brick walls? Well, I suspect some of you got the answer right, and some of you didn't. This is a question taken from the book in the middle here, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, where he looks at the way that we make decisions. And primarily he divides it up into 2 different components, a fast or gut approach to making decisions and a slow, much more cortical process. The reality, this is not a lecture on decision making, is that we can learn how to make better decisions. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in this subject, and you should be, to have a look at the book on the far right, Decisive by Chip and Dan Heath, which gives you a nice model as to how you can improve your decision making. One of the ways that we can improve our decision making is by asking the right question. Because if you ask the right question, you'll often find the right answer. One of my favorite questions is, what's the most important question you should ask yourself before initiating treatment on a patient? And this is my answer. Do I actually know what I'm doing here? Because that will determine what happens next. The problem with practice is we all want to be awesome, because we think that our practice will lead to a concomitant performance. but it doesn't always. So let's move on to stress. What's the effect of stress on our working memory? Well, as you can see from this diagram, it makes it smaller. And in fact, I used to say as a joke that it turns you into a binary unit. You either do nothing, which is your classic rabbit in the headlights response, or you do something, which is where you focus on just doing one thing, which may or may not be the right thing to do. It's what we call a fixation error. Of course, there's also a -1 response, which is where you run around with your hair on fire. If I were to say to you, I want you to imagine going into a party and you've got a lovely glass of Chateauneuf de Pape, and as you walk into the hostess's room, you notice that she has a beautiful white carpet. What is your brain screaming at you? Interestingly, if you want to learn the science behind this, there's a great paper here called How to Say, Think or Do Precisely the Worst Thing for Any Occasion. The other problem with stress is that it can affect your learning, it affects uptake into long-term memory, although the additional factor that can also affect your uptake into your long-term memory is that of arrogance. But stress makes us stupid. This is a drop. I ride a mountain bike. This is a drop that I ride quite regularly, but I recently crashed into this tree that you see here. You may question, of course, the sanity of a man of my age riding a bike, but it is one of the ways that I do manage my stress until I crash, of course. So we need to become stress management experts, and there are long-term strategies as the ones I mentioned here. And there are also short-term strategies such as box breathing, which is incredibly valuable for managing stress in the moment. As you start to put all these ingredients together, you start to work to what the Sky and British Cycling have popularized the aggregation of marginal gains approach to performance. And by finding a little improvement, a little margin of improvement in everything you do, you get a big margin of improvement in what you're actually trying to achieve. It has worked very well for the British Olympic cycling team and Sky Cycling. So much so that they've even got their own Lego package. And some of the examples of the way that they aggregate marginal gains is obviously by looking at and maximizing the incredible equipment that they use, plasticized suits, custom built bikes. The bikes are all immaculately cleaned. Cooling devices, magic chairs. I think one of my favorite stories when they won their recent Tour de France, they were challenged by the French team to say that they were cheating. There was something wrong with their equipment, particularly their wheels. To which Dave Brailsford's reply was, yes, there is something exceptional about the wheels. They're round. And more so, they're French. If we contrast the extraordinary equipment and approach at Sky to the NHS, here is a couple of things that I picked up recently in the hospital. This is not really the best way to put a neck collar on. For those of you who haven't put neck collars on, this is not a way I would recommend doing it. And this device here is the needle holder that was supplied to my midwives recently for sewing up episiotomies. But the problem was it didn't actually grip the needle, which made sewing up episiotomies extremely challenging because the person who'd chosen the equipment didn't do that specific skill. So scientists have discovered a new product, help you live longer, enhance your memory, makes you more attractive, keeps you slim and lowers food cravings, protects you from cancer and dementia, wards off colds and flu, lowers your risk of heart attacks, stroke and diabetes. You'll feel happier, less depressed and less anxious. Are you interested? Well, of course you are. So this particular component is the most performance enhancing agent that we have been able to find. It is, of course, sleep. So anything that you can do to improve your sleep will improve your performance. This is some work that we've been doing looking at performance, linking it to a heart rate monitor that you wear long term. So this is 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock the following morning. This particular gentleman is not a medic. He jumps out of planes for a living. On this longitudinal axis is his heart rate. Now, the blue bits are him jumping out of an aeroplane. Now, blue is good. That's exercise, and it's not stress related. Something happens to him when he gets home at 6 o'clock. He gets this massive rise in stress response. And what is rather concerning is not only does it cause this massive physiological effect here, but it stops him sleeping for at least 4 hours. And he couldn't understand why, although he went to bed at 10 o'clock and got up at 6, he would wake up feeling exhausted. So, what do you think he was doing that would have such a damaging effect on his sleep? So there are marginal gains in everything. Marginal gains in life, healthcare, speed eating, sport, aviation. Some of the work that I've tried to set up in my hospital is looking at both video feedback by getting what we call point of view. So this is the view of the supervisor, and this is my view of the actual spinal anesthetic. This data here is actual physiological data. What happens to my physiology when I'm in that stressful position? And you can compare and contrast experts such as consultants with novices such as trainees. Of course, the cyclists are way ahead of us on this. They can actually do real-time monitoring, and they can tell if people are struggling, and they can link the heart rate data to their speed and their power output in such a way that you can get some very useful and high-quality data. Because all of this information enables you to improve your situation awareness. This is an example of not improving your situation awareness. So, other ways that you can improve your performance at work is being aware in yourself and your colleagues of what we call the HALT acronym. So it starts in this corner: hungry, angry, late, tired. These obviously are not recommendations. They're recommendations not to have those particular responses. And ideally, if you've got sufficient spare bandwidth, then you should be making sure that your colleagues are looked after. I personally carry regular little packets of chocolate chip cookies, and when I can see my colleagues' performance dipping, we'll often offer to make them a cup of tea and give them something to eat. Unfortunately, in our jobs, we're going to have to learn to work with being tired, but that means we need to try and maximize the other components of the HALT acronym. So I'm going to finish with a final practical example of performance under pressure and how to maximize it. It's not a medical one, but I quite like the philosophy behind this. So this was the Knowlesy individual time trial, I think, in the Tour of Britain in 2017. Now, you may not remember what the weather was like on the Tuesday, 17th September then, but funny enough, I do, because I happened to be in London that day. And it was horrible. It was bitterly cold. It was raining. And this is the route. It's a 10-mile time trial, so not very long. It's primarily straight lines. But there are a couple of roundabouts here, here, and here, where the road was very slippery and very dangerous. This is a picture of the eventual winner, Bradley Wiggins, being overtaken by a small elephant. And this is the last bit of the route, just showing those roundabouts. There's one there, and then there's a sharp left-hand bend into the game park. Now, obviously, they'd done all the things. They'd made sure that they were fueled appropriately. They'd rested. The bike was in immaculate condition, etc., etc. But because the weather was so horrible, very few of the riders actually went out and actually raced the route, as opposed to Bradley Wiggins. And what he did was, for each of these roundabouts, He went through the roundabouts at a varying speed. So he first went through at 30 kilometers an hour, which I think some of us could probably sustain. He then cycled around it at 40 kilometers an hour, which is getting a bit more difficult, I think, for most of us, even on a flat circuit. He then cycled around that roundabout at 50 kilometers an hour. And finally, he got a car to tow him around at 60 kilometers an hour, which I suspect is beyond most of us, in all fairness. But he knew he could get round those roundabouts without crashing. And he took so much time on just that short section of the road that he beat the next fastest rider by over 42 seconds. So, in order to improve medical performance, we need to make sure that we do the right knowledge, practice a lot, particularly in the 4 components, so that our behavior links to our performance. Remember, we're going to be judged always on our worst performance and not on our best. Sad but true. So, when you think about learning it right, think about Max Planck. When you think about practicing it right, think about Anders Ericsson. Linking those two to performing it right, think of Dave Brailsford. And what I'd like you to do before you leave this session is on your phones, put a reminder in for 6 months' time and write down 3 things that you'll do as a result of listening to this talk. As I leave you with my take-home message, from a working memory capacity standpoint is this: what we process, we learn. If we're not processing life, we're not living it. Live life. Stay safe, and thanks very much indeed for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stacey. That was absolutely fantastic, and I have certainly learnt a lot from your talk, as I've learnt so much from the previous talks that I've heard you speak at. Please do post your questions in the FDocs Slack channel if you want to ask Dr. Stacey anything about performance under pressure. Our next speciality talk, coming in February, will be a look at behaviour change and motivation, and will be done by Dr. Lucy Morris, who is a GP and a medical school's communications lead. Please look out for our future speciality webinars through our Medics.Academy channels, both on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And please check out our other materials on our Medics.Academy website at www.medics.academy. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have a lovely rest of your evening.